Welcome to the South Orange Library's lecture series, Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, and I'm so excited to have Pamela Erens with us tonight. Robin Black was supposed to be here too to talk about her book, but she had to cancel due to illness, unfortunately. So we wish her a speedy recovery and excited to talk to Pamela about this wonderful book, Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life. I spent many happy days with that book, immersed in the book and underlining things in the book and starring things. And it's truly beautifully written and insightful about the writing life and Middlemarch and life in general. So I'm really pleased to be here with Pamela tonight. I want to tell you a bit more about Pamela before we get into the discussion, and also just point out that Jason from Words Bookstore is here behind you. And so if you'd like to buy Pamela's, he has Pamela's two recent books, Matasha and Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life. He also has Robin's book for sale, which is a great book about Mrs. Dalloway. So, Pamela Erens is the author of 3 novels for adults, The Virgins, 11 Hours, and The Understory. Matasha, a novel for readers aged 10 to 14, and Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life, a meditation on the classic work by George Eliot. Erens' books have appeared on many Best of the Year lists, including at NPR, The New Yorker, Kirkus, The New Republic, and LitHub. A 2-time recipient of New Jersey State Council on the Arts Fellowships, she has also been a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction, the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing, and the John Gardner Fiction Book Award. Her essays and criticism have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, Vogue, Elle, Slate, Virginia Quarterly Review, and Los Angeles Review of Books. Reader's Digest named Erens one of 23 contemporary writers you should have read by now. I'm so curious about that 23, the number, right? Why 23? Why 23? So please join me in welcoming Pamela Erens. Thank you, Pamela. Would you like to start by reading a little bit from the book? Or okay, great.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to the South Orange Public Library, and thanks to you guys for coming out on a gorgeous evening. I'm going to read for a few minutes from the very beginning of the book, just to give you a sense of what this book is, how it's coming at George Eliot's novel. And the title of the first chapter is Pinned by Sentences. When I felt as if I were coming apart in college, which was much of the time, I turned to George Eliot, sometimes to Jane Austen or Henry James or Tolstoy, but mostly to Eliot, and above all to her masterpiece, Middlemarch. Why would an 1872 novel about the English provinces feel like salvation to an urban American child of the 1960s and 70s? Middlemarch, to oversimplify, is the story of 3 marriages and 3 tangled inheritances against the backdrop of English politics and medical practice in the 1830s. In 1983, I was a 20-year-old who was struggling with an eating disorder, anxiety, and a tendency to screw up my romantic relationships. What could reading Middlemarch possibly do about these difficulties? It was a summer roommate who introduced me to the book. I met Caroline in an introduction to German class at Yale. She was sweet and quiet with beautiful eyes hidden by large glasses, a young woman who in her self-possession seemed closer to 30 than to my age. She had a long-time boyfriend, a graduate student who was practically the only person she spent time with, and together they were as sensible and unexcitable as a long-married couple. When Caroline wasn't with her boyfriend, she read. She read voluminously. Among the many books she consumed that summer was Middlemarch. She was reading it for the second time. She claimed its 900-some pages flew by. I was intrigued and bought my own copy, a Fat Penguin edition. The reason I stayed in town over the summers was my psychoanalyst was there. At 57, I must be among the youngest living graduates of classic psychoanalytic psychotherapy. For 6 years, 3 times a week, I walked down to the Yale Child Study Center, lay down on a couch, and free associated. In those days, analysis was the psychotherapy of choice for educated, affluent American sufferers from life. My father had been shrunk, and my mother too. When I started showing signs of distress, this was the option they turned to. Psychoanalysis is much maligned these days, but it was probably perfect for me. I was ruminative, desperate to sort myself out, and didn't like people telling me what to do. What could be better than a form of therapy that involved me getting to say anything, and the analyst almost nothing? In addition, the language of shame and desire and the belief in hidden psychological wellsprings of behavior came naturally to me. I took to analysis for the same reasons I'd taken to reading novels as a child. Both were about the circumstances we grow up in and what we do with them, about human character and the outcomes it creates. I also took to analysis for the same reason I took to writing fiction, the free association method in which the patient says whatever comes into her mind, no matter how absurd, irrelevant, or fragmentary, was like the initial stages of composing a short story. What goes down on the page is dreamlike and malleable before the writer has to start figuring out what the story is and how she will stitch it together. I was introverted at 20, uneasy around noisy college pursuits that involve crowds and boisterous drinking. I didn't care about football games and didn't thrill to the a cappella group performances that were a hallowed social ritual at Yale. Mostly I went to classes and my analytic sessions, did my schoolwork, hung out with my boyfriend, or wished I had one, and read. I liked to read in and of itself and because I felt safe when I did. It was a way to have all kinds of experiences without going anywhere and without getting hurt physically or emotionally. There was no particular trauma in my upbringing to account for my skittish and escapist temperament. It was simply my temperament. My classes as a literature major were heavy on theory, deconstruction, psychoanalytic theory, feminist theory. There was surprisingly little novel reading. So I worked my way through this part of the Western canon on my own in the lovely, quiet, post-midnight hours before sleep, after my classwork was done. The writers who captivated me shared a certain aspect of voice, a stance toward their subject matter. This voice had authority. It was possessed of a remarkable amount of knowledge about the world and offered its views assertively. Pierre was one of those people who are strong only when they feel themselves perfectly pure, writes Tolstoy in War and Peace. Miss Brooke had that kind of beauty which seems to be thrown into relief by poor dress, begins Middlemarch. For a confused young adult eager to grab onto any certainties about life, this voice was extremely appealing. The narrators of the novels I read stood on secure ground, confident of their take on any situation. If a genie had appeared at the time and granted me one wish, and if I'd been self-aware enough to articulate it, I would have answered, "Give me a vantage point from which I can see what is true and good." Henry James, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Leo Tolstoy, Edith Wharton, E.M. Forster, or at least the narrators who were their stand-ins, all had that vantage point. I enjoyed other authorial styles too, Faulkner's hypnotic intricacies, the operatic emotionalism of Dostoevsky, the linguistic high spirits of Bellow. But I clung to the sentences of the Apollonian masters. Those sentences might be complicated, but they parsed perfectly. They were clear, analytical, witty, and wise. On my worst days, when I felt like a skin that could barely contain the misery inside, it was literally sentence by sentence that I got through the minutes and hours. Opening Pride and Prejudice or The Mill on the Floss, I channeled my attention down the clauses and subclauses. It took patience to read those longish, well-balanced sentences, and I needed that slowing down. I absorbed one unit of meaning, then the next. What meditators do with breath, I did with sentences. They gave my frightened, obsession-prone brain something to do, my exorbitant feelings of focus. They kept me in one place, focused and calm, or at least calm enough. George Eliot's Middlemarch held me most of all.
Thank you. That's a great intro to the book. My first question is, how did you come to write this book? as a novelist, I know we can kind of hide behind fiction, and so it would strike me as being a very different experience to open up and be straightforward about your life and your struggles for a nonfiction book like this. If you could talk about that a bit.
It is different writing nonfiction. Fiction does have that wonderful mask where you can imagine yourself into others and play out some of your own dramas, but in a completely different form. But I always have written nonfiction, not at book length, but I've written about other authors and musicians and cultural figures in shorter form, and those have had pieces of autobiography in them. This was different, though. I've thought about Middlemarch forever. I mean, as you just learned, I first read it at 20. All my life, it's been this touchstone for me. And I think in the back of my mind, I had some vague idea that I would one day write about it, but I didn't really get it together. And then Rebecca Mead, who's a New Yorker writer that many will know, came out in 2014 with her book, My Life in Middlemarch. And I thought, oh, damn it. She did it, and I didn't do it fast enough, and I didn't. And I thought that was that. It's a wonderful book, by the way. I even reviewed it at the time. It's a terrific book. And I sort of thought that was that. I lost my chance. I didn't jump in soon enough. And then I met, in this very town, Robert Lasner, the publisher of IG Publishing, which publishes this series of books by authors about formative works. And I didn't know him, but I was at a friend's house. She was having a little party, I forget for what, and he was there, and I was introduced to him. So then I sort of followed what his press was doing, and at one point I became aware of this series. And I also became aware that all the books were by men, and they were all about books by men. And just because I was feeling feisty, I sent Robert an email saying, hey, like that series, but it's all men about men. Don't you think you should do some women on women? And if you ever want me to do Middlemarch, my favorite novel, I'm here. And that was that. He didn't answer. And then he didn't answer. Until 9 months later.
Oh,
and 9 months later, he sent me an email and said, hey, were you serious about that Middlemarch thing? Oh, if I'm not talking into it, please raise your hand and wave, and I'll realize. He said, were you serious about that Middlemarch offer? And I said, yes, I am very serious. And we had to talk about Rebecca Mead's book, and would it be too much of a repeat? But as we thought about it, we thought, come on, Middlemarch, I mean, it's a masterpiece. It's 960 pages long. There's clearly room for more than one book about this. Plus, I'm not Rebecca Mead. I'm not a reporter. She did a lot of reporting, like on the boots on the ground reporting for this, going to places that George Eliot had been, and that was not my intent to do that. It was more about the formation of a writer and a person.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how that came about.
That's great.
That's a great origin story. I didn't expect that at all. Oh, I love it. So would you say that Middlemarch is the most influential book that you've read in your life as a writer? Okay, so as a person. Okay. So could you explain why? What is it about this book?
I think it has to do with the breadth and the generosity of vision that George Eliot has, or sometimes I want to say the narrator. I hate to attribute things to authors because the books are always told really through a sort of imagined narrator. But it's so generous in its view of human nature and so knowledgeable. And I guess it just created a standard to aspire to, one I can never get to because George Eliot was a genius and singular, but something to aspire to both as a person and as a writer. And what I did discover as I developed as a writer through my 20s, 30s, etc., was that I could not write like her. I mean, I tried in my early years and it was ridiculous. It's not just that nobody can be her, it's that I can't even write in her vein. I don't write books with dozens of characters. I don't write, sort of broad social commentary and satire. That's not me, and I had to learn almost to write against her. And there were other writers I found that I could really draw more directly from for my own writing.
Right. That makes sense. You talk about, there's that great quote from your book, which I thought I had. Here it is. Some novels are like fascinating but small and sealed off rooms. Middlemarch made me feel that I was out in the open country under a great blue sky, pulling big breaths of fresh air into my lungs. So that seems to be what you're saying, is that, so do you feel like you write more fascinating, small, sealed room novels?
At best, they're fascinating. I think they are smaller sealed rooms. Yeah, they're usually much more contained in time and in terms of how many characters are being followed. I sometimes think as some writers go broad and some writers go vertical, and I feel like I'm a vertical writer. And, you know, George Eliot, God bless her, was somehow horizontal and vertical, which is very rare.
Right. So deep, wide and deep at the same time. Yeah. Another great quote from the book is, what happens in a story, your book, not Middlemarch, what happens in a story is far less important than how the narrator tells that story. The narrator is the story. Could you talk about that line in relation to Middlemarch and also in relation to your own fiction?
So Middlemarch, for those who don't already know this, is the story of a town called Middlemarch in Midlands, basically provincial England. And it's got a complicated plot, as mentioned in the excerpt I read, about inheritances and their marriages, and there's criminal behavior, and there's politics, and there's medicine. But none of that really is the book. To me, the book is the outlook of the narrator, which is godlike to me in that it's a benevolent. If you picture God as benevolent, then it's godlike. She is all accepting, all understanding, and to me, that is the real story of Middlemarch. It's that point of view, because it's funny and it's very perceptive about people, and so to me, that's what I get from it more than the plot points, although those are fascinating, particularly as a woman, the ones about marriage and the development of young women. And you asked something else.
In relation to your own
to my own writing. Well, I feel like that was almost the most important thing I ever learned as a writer, that it's what makes a piece of writing work in the end is that voice or point of view that you employ. That's conveying something of a worldview to your reader. And nothing that I write really gels until I find that voice and that point of view. And it's different for everything that I write. And it's not always as lovely and generous as, there are narrators who are less wonderful and lovable than George Eliot's. But it has to be some sort of lens on the world so that it can select and it can, shape and it can, and then you have work. And until I understood that, I was sort of all over the place as a writer.
So you just mentioned a couple of things I want to return to. One of them is, you mentioned that some of your characters or narrators are less lovable than others, and you do talk about likability of characters a bit in the book, which is one of my big pet peeves. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about, or when someone comes up to you and says, this character is so unlikable, I could not read this book, says that about your own work or someone else's. How do you respond? How do you react to that?
So this is one of my pet peeves too. I really, Yeah,
And it's usually female characters.
It's usually female characters, and Claire Massoud has written and said some wonderful things about that, because I think she's very attuned to the way in which this is usually used against women authors and women characters. And I just don't understand it. I mean, I want a character or a narrator to be interesting. I don't need to like them, as long as they're interesting. I mean, how many people do we know in our own lives that are not always that likable? Even the ones we love are not always that likable. And then there are ones we really don't like. But a book to me is about seeing something I haven't seen before, experiencing something that maybe I haven't experienced in quite the same way. So I don't need to feel like the person I'm reading about, and I don't need to like the person I'm reading about. So I guess that's my answer. How about you answer?
It's the same for me. I don't feel like I'm reading to make friends. I'm reading to learn and understand the human condition and psyche and about the world. So same thing. I do not need a character to be cuddly in order to want to read the book. Yeah. So another thing you mentioned was that you said that the book was funny, that Middlemarch is funny. And I know in the book you spend some time talking about how this is not something that we generally think about Middlemarch, that it's funny. But it is. Could you talk a little bit about that, the humor that you find?
I think the humor comes from just her deep understanding of human nature and all the really silly and self-deluding things that we do. I think the bulk of her humor is sort of unveiling in a mostly empathic way our incredible lack of self-knowledge, like the way, and we can all see it in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. And she's like the narrator who sees it in everybody. She's got a great ear, so she replicates speech in a way that's often very amusing. People's verbal tics, the things that are very revealing about the way they talk. And yeah, she's just, it's like a fond older sister who sees the foibles of a younger sister. I feel like that's almost her attitude. It's fond and it's funny and it's a little teasing. And so it's a kind of bubbly, it's not like guffaw humor. It's kind of like a light bubbly humor.
That's nice. It's a little bit related to my next question about narrative. In your book, you say every significant character in Middlemarch has a narrative he tells himself about who he is and how his life will take shape, kind of connected to our blindness about ourselves, right? As do we, the livers of real life. And how agonizing it is when we see evidence that our narrative is not unfolding the way it is supposed to. I can definitely relate to this quote and having, this narrative about, okay, this is who I am, this is how this will happen, and having that, be upset by real life. Can you talk about how reading Middlemarch through the years helped you with your own shifting narratives? That would be great.
I think that's the part of Middlemarch that becomes more and more rewarding as you get older when you read it, because of course at 20 you still have that narrative. This is, I'm going to become a famous writer and I'm going to, do this and I'm going to fly an airplane. And that was one of my things. I was determined I was going to learn how to fly. And then I took I took a 15-minute lesson once and I went up and I knew I was never going to learn how to fly. That was that. But so that's what age brings. And even by the time I read it a second time, I was already married. I knew there were limits to my writing talent. I mean, I still hoped I would accomplish something, but I knew I wasn't going to be George Eliot. I knew I wasn't going to be, I was already like 30, 31. I wasn't going to be this incredible wunderkind, writer. And then, and then when you have kids, you learn, in my 40s, reading it again, you learn that, there are sort of limits on the control you have over their lives, over who they are, over how they'll be, what you can protect them from, what you can't. So every time that I've read it, it's become a reminder of that lesson. And her stories in Middlemarch are really stories of either grace or less grace under that growing awareness. There are people who buck against the failure of their narratives and can't accept it. There are others who accept it and it's painful, but they find a way to move on. And I find both really moving and heartening. I mean, not the ones who really make their lives more painful by not accepting the death of a narrative, but I find it, incredibly moving.
And you talked too just about how reading the sentences, like that too is a kind of soothing mechanism for you. And there is a lot of discussion about mental health in your book. And I was particularly moved by this one line that reads, "What meditators do with breath, I did with sentences." And you end the book too with this lovely line, sorry, it's a spoiler, but the last line is, "I know what it is like to be saved by sentences." I was wondering, I love that line, if you could talk about that a bit too.
I guess for me, books, even from a little kid, there's something about language. I guess it's a musical thing almost, the rhythm of language, the sound, and even the look of letters. I was a kid that, like, the alphabet fascinated me, just the different shapes. And so I guess there's just something in me that is very soothed, like some people are soothed by music. I am also soothed by music. That when I read, I feel like I fall into rhythms, and those rhythms are comforting, assuming the book is also good and is conveying something intelligent and interesting. And it was a way, and has always been a way for me, of sort of calming myself, slowing myself down, which we really need in this world, even more than almost 40 years ago when I started reading Middlemarch. It's incredible, like how much speedier even life has become in that time. And I think it's like any practice that focuses one. I mean, some people with needlecraft, some people with gardening. There's all kinds of different things, but I think reading is my primary one. Yeah.
Yes, I understand that. So you read Middlemarch at 20 first, and then you read it again at 40. Is that right? No. Then you read it
been basically every 10 years.
every 10 years. So you think you'll read it again?
Yeah.
And what about Eliot's other books? Do you respond to her other books too? What are some of your other favorites?
Oh, I love so many of them. Daniel Deronda is a wonderful book. Mill on the Floss is a wonderful book. Adam Bede, which was her first full-length novel, is wonderful. And her very first book, which is called Scenes from Clerical Life, was a collection of 3 novellas. And that's wonderful. I can think of like one book that's kind of okay. Like, she didn't write a huge number of books. But they're all worthwhile. I mean, there's nothing I wouldn't read by her except maybe her poetry and her plays. I'm not that interested in that. There's one novel I have never been able to get myself to get to, and it's called Romola, and it's about 16th century Florence and Savonarola, if I'm pronouncing that right, and I just can't quite get into it. It's very historical, and it's not considered one of her best books, but I'll probably get to that eventually too, just for the heck of it.
Yeah. So I know that Middlemarch is a major touchstone book for you. Is there another touchstone book you could tell us about, or just a book that you've read recently that you loved?
Well, funny enough, because Robin Black was supposed to be here, Mrs. Dalloway is another one of my touchdowns, Into the Lighthouse. The pair of those. And her book, by the way, is gorgeous. Robin's book on Mrs. Dalloway, and should not be missed. Virginia Woolf in those two books has had a huge influence on me as a writer. And so that I would definitely call the touchstone. There are so many books. I almost, can't begin, but...
What about a recent book?
A recent book that's a touchstone?
Or that you loved.
That I love. Greatly enjoyed. Well, I loved Ruth Ozecki's... I did this in another interview. I blanked the book of Form and Emptiness. I also love her earlier book, A Tale for the Time Being, and maybe it's not surprising that I love her work because I find in it the same empathy, the same compassion for all her characters. And there's a Zen Buddhist aspect. She's a Zen Buddhist monk as well as a novelist, not a super, common combination. And you can see the influence of that in her work. So I absolutely recommend Ruth Ozecki. She's great.
Since you mentioned Robin's book and Mrs. Dalloway, one of the questions I had for both of you was that those books they're both looking at the individual in society, but in very different ways. Could you just talk a bit about how she looks at that and how Eliot looks at that and maybe also Woolf very differently?
Yeah, Robin and I have talked about this, and I hope I won't misrepresent her thoughts about Mrs. Dalloway. Eliot was still writing at a time when there was largely settled morals around family and and she's also writing about an earlier period, 1830s, when certainly that was the case. And so I talk about this a little bit in my book. There's a very clear set of guidelines for how people should be living their lives. And when individuals deviate from that, it's very clear. So both the central characters in Middlemarch, who are Dorothea Brooke, who's 19 years old, and Tertius Lydgate, who's a 27-year-old doctor, they don't do the right things in the eyes of society to some extent, and that becomes an issue. I've heard Robin, say that, and I agree, this is persuasive to me, that by the time you get to Virginia Woolf in 1920s and post-World War I England, there's been a certain breakdown of society in some ways, and the trauma of the First World War, and a society kind of trying to patch itself back together after that. So there's, and it's urban also, it takes place in London, so there's a little bit more of this atomization of urban life. And the individual society gets played out differently there. And I know Robin talks in her book about, so how does a society move on from a terrible war where they've sent young men who, if they've come back, are very, very damaged by this, and how do they reabsorb them or reject them? And that's part of what Mrs. Dalloway is about. And the cost, the way the cost to individuals of, things like war, which we're, dealing with again today.
Thank you. I just wanted to see if anybody has any questions in the audience for Pamela. If you don't, I have a couple more, but please.
Bring them on.
Come on.
Bring them on.
Yes.
What's the longest and what is the shortest amount of time
To complete one of your books?
One of my
So
books?
I'll just repeat the questions. I think we're recording. I'm not sure what's going on, but so what's the longest and the shortest amount of time that it took you to complete one of your books?
So the shortest was this book. It took less than a year it's easier for me to write nonfiction than fiction. Fiction definitely takes longer, and you know, it was a very bounded project. You know, the the project agenda was clear, and my longest would have been my first. I mean, in some ways, it took 10 years. I wasn't writing all that time, but on and off, it took probably 10 years to complete that. And I think that's often the case with the first book, that it sort of takes your whole life to write that first book, because you're just learning and figuring out what you're doing. And my first book, by the way, is no bigger really than that book, but it took 10 times as long.
That's the way it goes. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you want to come forward? And
Oh, yeah,
so we
that would
can
be
hear
great.
you? Sorry about that.
Did you feel differently about the book, knowing you were writing about it? I mean,
Oh.
reading it while you were writing it.
Right.
Did you feel differently about the book, about Middlemarch, knowing that you were writing about it, was the question.
That's a great question. And the truth is, though, no. I guess I mulled the book so much over time. I kind of knew some of my basic feelings about it. And reading it with a thought to writing didn't really change that, just kind of deepened it. And as we were talking about with sentences, I read slowly. So it wasn't even a different kind of, it wasn't like I whipped through it in the past and then I slowed down to do this. I took notes, which was different, but I just think I appreciated it even more this time, not because I was writing it, but because I was reading it during COVID and during some other circumstantial things that were going on in my life, and I was even more appreciative for the comfort it was bringing.
It must have felt like you were part of that. I don't know, it must have felt soothing to be part of that big community during COVID, right? Imaginary community. Yeah. Yes.
When I first heard the title of the book, I thought, wait a minute, there's already a book with that title. You know, can you actually legitimately title a book? I thought you could never title something if it's already been used. It's a silly question, but
So-
I got curious.
Yeah, so she is asking about titling a book the same as another book, but it's a little different.
Yeah. So two answers to that. It actually, Rebecca Mead's is My Life in Middlemarch, and mine is Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life. So they're a bit different, but there are books that have the same title. Titles are not copyrighted. I learned that a long time ago. So you could, if you had a book called The Old House, you knew someone wrote that book, but you wanted to write a book with the same title, you could. And readers would just have to figure out which was which.
Or sometimes if you come up with a really great book title you love, the first thing you do is go on Amazon, type it in, see what comes up. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it, but if it's like a recent book, that's not a great thing.
Isn't one of your books in a town something like Maplewood?
Is one of your books set in a town like Maplewood?
I actually had to think. Not centrally, but there's in the Virgins, one of the characters comes from a town in New Jersey, which I did base on South Orange. Yeah.
In the Virgins.
Yes. Yes.
Anyone else? I have a question. So
Yes, Laura.
yes. So what else inspires you aside from books? You mentioned music. Any other art forms, or I don't know, anything else? What else inspires you writing wise?
Visual art, very much. I love to go to museums. I spend a lot of time there when I can. I don't know if it directly inspires, me in the sense of, that I come up with an idea that I can put in a book, but it has that same effect of making my head just feel opened up, like making me feel like the world is larger. And that's that same feeling I get from Eliot and certain other writers, that I start to feel excited. I feel like, you just put it so well, like this invisible community. I feel like there's an invisible community of makers and creators, and just touching that always feels so great. It makes me feel like, it's worth doing all this.
Any artists in particular?
Well, I'll just mention ones I've seen recently. I went to the Winslow Homer exhibit at the Met, which was great. The Faith Ringgold exhibit at the New Museum. The Turner exhibit in Boston was amazing. I really didn't know Turner's work, and I always got him confused with Winslow Homer, which is so embarrassing, but now I know which one's which. I don't know, it's only about boats and water, but I got it straight now. Very different. That's recent. Yeah.
And so if you could give an aspiring writer one piece of advice, what would you say? Do you have an answer for this?
It's kind of a boring answer, because I'm sure most people have heard it, but just read a whole lot, read all the time. And then just keep the faith, because it's really hard to get published, and it's very discouraging. And most of us who are writers have gone through a lot of discouragement. And you just have to have a little something in you that says, I don't care what anybody else says. This is what I need to be doing. This is what I'm going to do, whether I get published or I don't get published. This is what I'm going to do. And it's, in the end, I think it's the people who commit to that who are most likely to get published in the end. And I've seen extremely, extremely talented writers not publish in the end because they got so discouraged. And it's the ones that stick it out that tend to see some results.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pamela. Unless anyone has a final question. Oh, yes, please. Can you not publish yourself? Yeah.
One can certainly publish oneself. People do it all the time, and it's become a more and more accepted way to go about things. It's daunting, I think, or at least I've always felt daunted by it, because you have to do all your own publicity, you have to do all your own marketing, you have to do your own printing, you have to do your own designing. And the truth is, even if you're published by what they call legacy publisher, you still have to do a lot of hustle for yourself in terms of marketing and publicity, but there are other things that a publisher takes care of that you don't have to. So it's a question of what kind of energy and, skills you have in those other areas, really.
Anyone else? Last chance? Okay. Thank you so much, Pamela. This was great to talk about this wonderful book, and don't forget, you can buy your copy right at the table there with Jason. Thank you all for coming, and we will be back June 9th, again in person at 6 p.m. for a conversation with novelist Carly Moore about her new novel, Panpocalypse. So, thank you again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.